I think it's 1 minute past 5, and we are late, in fact. Hopefully, everyone that wanted has already joined us. And I want to introduce to you Barbara Zipser, whom you very well know. I just wanted to say that I'm really very thankful that you wanted to find some time to join us today. And today we'll have a lecture and hopefully a very stimulating discussion after that. And the lecture will be on John Actuarius and actually about dietary changes as treatment proposed by him. So, Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to give this lecture in Łódź, which is a great honor. Today I'm going to talk about dietary measures as treatment in Ioannes Archiatrus, and it will be very much a specialized research lecture. So the reason why I'm giving this lecture is because I think that we need to reevaluate the medical procedures mentioned in ancient Greek and Byzantine medicine. It is well possible that we do not fully understand the reason why these measures were prescribed and what they were meant to do. It is very well possible that these measures could be of use for the present, because we are still in a process of discovery, and perhaps there was some valid treatment. I personally believe that there was, because these measures were prescribed over centuries and evaluated. A good example as to why we are still in the process of discovery are stomach ulcers. When I went to school, they were regarded as a mental health problem, and then it was discovered that they are an infection. So a complete paradigm shift, and suddenly they're no longer treated with sedatives and psychotherapy. They are treated with antibiotics. There was a slight change in plan. I initially said in my outline that I'd be talking about statistics, but statistics don't work well in podcasts. And this is why I'm now focusing on methodology and other matters that are easier to explain without a handout or a PowerPoint. A disclaimer: I don't have any medical training, and don't do anything on my advice. So anything I'm saying is just for information. While I've verified it all to the best of my knowledge, don't try it out at home, please. In means of acknowledgements, I'm drawing from work that was funded by a Wellcome Trust Collaborative Award. I was the PI, and the co-investigators were Bob Alkin and Mark Nesbitt from Kew, Andreas Lardos from Zurich, and Andrew Scott from Royal Holloway. The research assistants were Rebecca Lazarou and Christina Patmore, and the final year collaborator was Ephraim Lev from Haifa. So I'm starting from scratch for all those who may not know our primary source. So the primary source was the vernacular version of Ioannes Archiatrus, which dates to the late 13th century and almost certainly to Cyprus. So the indicators that it is indeed from Cyprus are getting stronger with every week almost at the moment. The text is unusual in that it is a product of a written tradition that goes back to Paul of Aegina and Zenon text and some other unknown sources. And while there was a very learned tradition in writing, at the end there was someone basically translated the condensed manual that came out of this process, this textual process, into the Greek vernacular, for which at the time there were no set spelling conventions, and the grammar was still in flux. And the text is a translation into the vernacular, and it also has a commentary. This makes it a very, very strange hybrid, because commentaries are part of a learned tradition. They're very academic, and a translation, okay, but a translation into the vernacular is definitely not academic, and in particular not the kind of content that was added by the translator. So some of the explanations that are added to the text are definitely not written by someone who had a very high education. We don't know whether the person wrote it himself, whether he could write, or whether he dictated the text, but he was definitely familiar with the formalities of medical manuals and also the genre of commentary. The structure of the text is roughly 2 head-to-foot cycles and just over 200 recipes, and some content is repeated. So there are sometimes multiple recipes for the same disease and in various positions of the text. It's mostly general practice, but also some specialist content, and there's very, very little magic. And the magic comes in one particular strand of the transmission. Why did we choose this text? It does contain information that a scholarly text would not have. So, for instance, the author and the commentator explains things in his own words, and these explanations are not in the scholarly manuals. So we have more information as to how they precisely prepared this medication, which was on the craft side of things and not usually described. He also describes diseases slightly differently, and sometimes also animals. The intended audience of the text is not wealthy, and the medical procedures have been reduced to a minimum in the text. 2 very important points. So here we are not talking about medical research papers. We are not talking about the top medical scientists in Constantinople or in Rome or in Pergamon having a debate. We are talking about applied medicine. And this gives it a completely different nature as well. Also because this audience really is not wealthy. So they had next to no resources. Some things had to be procured locally. And this also means that they would not have, they wouldn't have invested money in things that may not work, and knew how to improvise. And then there were also other formalities in that the text had precisely the right length you need for a study as we did. Yeah, so we have a fairly clear geographic and chronologic focus for this text as well, which is quite important. We could compare it to plants that grow in this area now, and we also had 2 paleobotanists on our team, which means that they could look back in time and check whether we are comparing the text against the right flora, as it were. So the next point on my handout would be, what do we know in means of pharmacy? So to what extent do we actually know what kind of treatment they were prescribing? Some pharmaceutical ingredients can be identified with high confidence because they are abundantly, clearly, and consistently described in other sources. For instance, olive oil, iron, honey, milk, all this is absolutely certain. There are just too many sources. Others can be identified with some confidence by comparing them across modern biomedical data, This is a research paper which is already online as a preprint, and which is currently under peer review. So we actually built up in our large team, which consisted largely of scientists, a methodology how we can that allows us to narrow down to what extent we are actually certain that our translation or identification of a plant name is correct. Largely it works by comparing candidate species against modern research, modern biomedical research. So in means of treatments, from the pharmaceutical point of view, we know quite a lot, but on isolated ingredients, but hardly any recipe consists of items where we know everything. So, a recipe would consist usually of about 5 ingredients, and of these 2 were absolutely easy to identify. So there's olive oil and there's honey, okay, or olive oil and vinegar, fine, and then the rest, it might get complicated. In means of the illnesses that are described, what do we actually know about them? Some illnesses can be identified with complete certainty, also because they are described. So the author actually really describes them in graphic details. So for instance, injuries, kidney stones, or bed sores, something like this, we're absolutely certain. So he would, for instance, say, if someone takes a stone and accidentally hits himself on the fingernail and the fingernail is smashed, then you do the following. So this is the way he would write. So we're certain about this. Most symptoms that are described can be identified with complete certainty, but not the cause of the symptoms. So for instance, cough, headache, hair loss, pain, we are fairly certain what this is, but these are just the symptoms. Some symptoms and most illnesses cannot be identified with high certainty. So, but still we are left with quite a lot to work with. In means of procedures that they prescribed, some of these treatments can be clearly identified. For instance, bloodletting, which is very clearly described, bathing, surgery, or dietary changes. So for these, we know what it is. Yeah. Okay, so having worked on this text again for such a long time, I came to the conclusion that new approaches are needed to understand basically what is happening here. What are these doctors doing and why? We need to rethink how we approach ancient and medieval sources, and laughing about these treatments is not the right way. Today, we also don't laugh about doctors in the 1980s who treated stomach ulcers as a mental health problem. Most of these doctors genuinely did the best they could to help the patient. Sometimes it's the wrong method, and we know this now. Yeah, I think there's lots of potential for us to learn from them. In the following, I'd like to introduce you to a number of new ideas that have come up in conversation with colleagues from sciences that I find particularly stimulating. One of these I'd like to acknowledge, these colleagues I'd like to acknowledge now, is Andrew Scott from Royal Holloway, a geologist who was part of the Wellcome Project. He worked on burnt substances that were added to pharmaceutical prescriptions, and he asked why. So we've all seen those recipes that say, burn a specific plant and then mix it with olive oil and then do this and this and this with it. And he asks why. What does this actually do if you burn this specific ingredient? So the answer is quite simple, that if you burn ingredients, they have afterwards have a specific structure. The coal has a specific structure, and depending on how long you fry them for, they will have a different surface, and this surface absorbs certain ingredients in plants. So if you have plant juice, it contains all sorts of different things, and if you mix it with specific types of coal, then some parts of this plant juice are absorbed and some are not. So if you mix a burnt ingredient with smashed up plants or something else, they actually modify it, and they modify the action of this medication. This is, I think, a very important output of the project. So we can now understand that it is not just, yeah, how do I phrase it? It's not something irrational they did, that they decided to burn something, but that it actually has a mode of action. And it really depends on how long you fry it for and at which temperature. So these are data that we don't have, unfortunately. They don't say, they just say fry it and then add it to. And then another point that he contributed to the project is that minerals can cancel out the absorption of other minerals. So if you eat certain foods, some parts of the food can actually prevent other parts of the food to be absorbed by the body. And with minerals, you've probably seen it in the news that, you know, zinc and copper can cancel each other out. This has come to light with, you know, the rising use of multivitamins and other food supplements. So if you have food supplements that contain different minerals, then mineral A can block mineral B from being absorbed. So it doesn't actually make sense to put everything into one tablet. So he also thinks that if you consume something that contains a specific minerals, these minerals might actually prevent other parts of the medication from being absorbed. So again, that modifies it. This could be a point as to why they used so many composite medications, that basically the combination was key rather than you know, just the single items, because right now most people look at single items and then potentially something like, yeah, some other ingredient like alcohol or olive oil to extract something. It's not necessarily the case. So they have, these composite medications have to be seen in context, and yeah. So there's lots of work ahead. We obviously couldn't do it all. We had some experiments. Unfortunately, they were delayed by the pandemic. So this was a rather, yeah, unfortunate, I think, is the best explanation, the best expression for it. So we now have quite a lot of these experiments done, and they are in the process of being submitted for publication. But for larger parts of the pandemic, the social distancing requirements meant that we could not. And for larger parts also of the project, the lab was basically completely closed. We started in November 2019 and had planned to start the experiments in March 2020, and we all know what happened then. Yeah. So, but still, I mean, some amazing thoughts to come out of his contribution to this. So it might actually be far more complicated than we think. The action of composite medication, and also how they interact, and in particular the coal aspect. So any kind of charred ingredients are of importance here. This, of course, then, we're also looking at the ingredients with the eyes of a paleobotanist and geologist, which he is, then raised in conversation the question whether some of the illnesses described could actually be mineral deficiencies or mineral overload. And the latter tends to be genetic. So this is, again, a possibility that needs to be discussed. And yeah, the other question, obviously, which plants cancel each other out and which minerals cancel each other out. And this also ties in with the question in which soil the plants were grown, because they can absorb differently. The next point, here I have to acknowledge Jennifer Cole from Royal Holloway and Hermine McCritchian from University of West London, is the microbiome. So the microbiome is something very enigmatic. There have been some studies, and some people now apply it to more complex research questions. In my text, in particular, there's one recipe that comes up that is also mentioned in other sources, which sounds really funny and has been regarded as magical for quite a long time. So this is sleeping next to a puppy or a young child as a treatment. And this raises the question, what does it actually do? In our text, it's mentioned as a treatment for indigestion and vomiting bile. So, yeah, I've just been asking myself, could this actually have a therapeutic value? What is currently going on in microbiome research is that they begin to question actually whether quite a lot of what is usually labeled as sort of social influences may not indeed have a biological action. So it keeps being mentioned in medical research papers that people who have a stable family life and so on generally have better health. So you think, okay, could be all sorts of reasons why that is. Perhaps it's just in their head, or they are happier, or whatever. But perhaps there are also differences. If we live in the same flat with children and another adult, if we keep pets, what does this actually do to our health? What is the influence here? So these thoughts are very much Hippocratic, this holistic view. As you know, since Hippocratic times, doctors carried out comprehensive reviews of living arrangements, so and various other environmental factors. They looked at family, lifestyle, nutrition, climate and the seasons, water, and also the microclimate inside buildings. And in which setting did the disease come about? So this is basically the question I've been asking myself with regards to the microbiome. And yeah, whether there are any other procedures that are mentioned here that we don't fully understand in this text. So obviously the new approach would be to check how these factors interact with the microbiome. Yeah, and also with this, we need a better differentiated approach to medicine. We need a gendered approach to medicine, and we need to take age more into account. So, yeah. We need to take the full context into account. Another approach that has come up, which is actually a rather funny story. So I've been taking part in a public engagement meeting, presentation, whatever you want to call it. And I was there with a stall with my poster representing medical history. It was organized by the biology department. And there were also external partners who came in. The theme of this presentation was rare diseases. And opposite me was a lady called Yamide Thomas from the Sickle Cell Society in London. And she put up a large banner saying sickle cells in very large print. And I looked at this banner for 2 hours because it was directly opposite me. So, and after those 2 hours, it suddenly began to sink in. So it took a while for me to realize. Thank you for putting up this banner. It was a great idea. So I've been wondering, since sickle cell also occurs in parts of the Mediterranean, I've been asking myself, could any of these procedures that I mentioned in my text, or any of these vague descriptions that we don't really understand yet, be actually referring to hemoglobin disorders? And then also in particular thalassemia, which occurs very frequently in this part of the world. So in particular pain disorders, because I mean, sickle cell crises quite often manifest as pain. So we have all these descriptions in ancient and medieval texts saying, if there is sudden pain somewhere. And I've been wondering, why doesn't it mention a trigger or a reason or a context? Why do we have all these chapters on, if you have pain in this part of the body? And then I suddenly realized perhaps pain was not just a symptom, but that was their way to systematize something that we now understand to be hematological disorders, because it actually sounds quite similar. So any kind of blood disorders can suddenly get worse if you have a change in temperature, so if the weather changes. And that again sounds very much like ancient and medieval medicine. I checked the research literature. So today they assume that thalassemia and sickle cell are not new. So they would have been around at the time. And so what did they do with these patients? And in this context, I came up with the conclusion suddenly that we need to reevaluate the practice of localized bloodletting. So, yes, what did this actually do? We also need to identify all potential instances of blood disorders where they are described. For instance, descriptions of a swollen spleen, which is very common in my text, and sudden pain brought on by a change in temperature, and to reevaluate the treatments and dietary measures that were prescribed for these. So with regards to bloodletting, circulation of the blood was not yet discovered. And in most cases, the for humor theory was false. An exception to this rule could be abundance of blood, where there's actually, quite a lot of truth to it. So did they perhaps get the treatment right with the wrong premise, or did they even understand it as an abundance of blood or a change in quality of blood? So bloodletting is still practiced today. It's for some blood disorders still the best treatment, for instance, iron overload or polycythemia vera. It might work in other instances as well, but today better treatments are available, so there's no research data on this. So this was just something that I'd like to flag up, that we really need to look into the blood disorders and any instances where pain is described as a disease, as it were. Perhaps it's that. Another item that recently came to my attention is vomiting. So quite a lot of the texts mention induced vomiting, which is actually poorly understood. If it's about food poisoning or something like this, it's quite clear that you basically remove whatever that was. But does it have any other effect? Could it have something to do with applying pressure on the blood vessels of the head, for instance? Could this do something? So that is another point I think that needs investigating. And in particular, since induced vomiting is in my text described as a treatment for sudden or intermittent visual disturbances, which doesn't make sense. And the same treatment is prescribed for a swollen spleen. So it's just one of those instances where I'm wondering. Yeah, so remember about the disclaimer, what I said, I don't have any medical training. So I obviously discourage anybody of doing anything like this. It's just a research and information, what I'm saying here. Another point that I think needs more investigation are the dietary measures. We know today that adding or removing fiber of specific type to food or to nutrition changes the microbiome in the gut, and it can influence the way food is absorbed. So it can influence, for instance, the way glucose or sugar is absorbed, the way fat is absorbed. And we have a lot in my text, quite a lot of recipes that say, do not eat any vegetables or do eat vegetables. So obviously this needs, in my opinion, better scrutiny to see what these vegetables actually do and what kind of effect that would have, or whether there's any other dietary reason why someone with a specific disease should not eat vegetables. Also, changes in dietary patterns, for instance, saying do not eat in the evening or do not eat at lunchtime or do not eat in the morning. This also influences the glucose metabolism. So for most people, if they don't eat, there are strong individual differences, but for most people, if they don't eat breakfast, they will have higher glucose levels for the rest of the day, just because the body basically resets at breakfast and remembers how much glucose they should eat. It doesn't work for some people, and that's the reason why I repeated my disclaimer. These dietary measures of, for instance, not having dinner or not having lunch or not having breakfast actually do modify how the food is absorbed. And that obviously could have a strong bearing on various diseases and not just the ones that come to mind immediately. This could be more complex and could have more wider implications. So yes, so that would be, from my point of view, another item that definitely needs investigating. So what does actually happen if someone skips a meal, and a specific meal in the day? And it also makes me wonder how much did they know about this? So it really, I mean, what really brought it back to me was when I translated the text. The translation is currently under review, so it's already been submitted. So I translated it into English, and this removed all the rough dialectal aspect of the text. So now it's standard English. It sounds a bit simple, but still, so standard English translation. And this brought quite a clearly defined pharmacy to light. So all the detail was really distracting for me, also from a linguistic point of view. And now you have it. The text has much more structure. So most recipes, yeah, it would be easier to understand why they combined certain things, for instance, and how they did it. Yes, and it also really emphasized to me that while this is a dialectal text, it actually might contain quite a lot of valid treatments, and in particular with the nutritional data. So not to eat certain things or to eat certain things, and then also to skip meals. So this is something that has not yet been investigated. Yeah, it might lead to some new understanding as to whether a modification of the gut microbiome or any changes to the general metabolism might have an indirect effect on other diseases. While this text, as I said, while this text is written in dialect, it has more medical reason than one might assume, and it's somehow easier to capture than in a learned text because the structure of these recipes is much easier to comprehend. So my conclusion for this paper is that we need to rethink the way treatments were applied in ancient and medieval times, and in particular, this is with regards to changes that are usually overlooked. So we all laugh about bloodletting as a treatment, and in particular localized bloodletting. But perhaps there was a reason why they did it. And also practices that were insofar thought to be magical. So perhaps there is some deeper reason to it. The investigation would involve quite a lot of factual input from other disciplines and potentially also lab experiments. So it would be a big project in collaboration between humanities and sciences, which I think is the only way forward if we are trying to understand what kind of treatment they actually did. Also, something that is really important to bear in mind is that if you applied a treatment, if a doctor applied a treatment, and if it didn't work, or if he was causing more harm than good with his treatments, first of all, he would go out of business, and second, he might be actually liable for it. We know that at various times there was a medical liability, and if it was not formalized, then perhaps it would have been in a village, it would have been, let's say, informal. That means that he would have to leave, for instance. So yeah, so I think that we might discover quite a lot of valid treatments in this text in particular. And the particular strength is that it describes in great detail and also in a way that a scholarly text would not do. And we also have this clear geographic and chronological focus as well. And it connects to two areas where hemoglobin disorders are very common. So yeah, so this is my paper, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and your input into the matter. Thank you.
I think once Barbara has finished, so now we can.
We'll switch off the light. I don't need my notes anymore.
We'll try to make it more friendly for the users on the net. I would like bump into the discussion. May I just ask one question?
Yes.
I mean, I just wonder, you are not a professional doctor yourself.
No.
As you mentioned,
no.
Yeah. But have you found a number, or at least enough medical doctors that would like to cooperate with you?
Not insofar, but I think it should be possible to find them. Insofar, I found botanists and a geologist and an ethnopharmacologist, and I think with the right topic, it should be very easy to find collaborators. I haven't done so yet because I have, as everybody else, yeah, we are currently finishing the outputs of the existing project. Yes, but it obviously needs proper medical scrutiny. So quite a lot of the points where I'm referring to other people, this comes from specialists. So it comes from for instance, from a geologist, or it comes from someone who does genetics research. So I have someone who does genetics research that I already have. But yes, I would need medical doctors. I would need people who know about diet as well.
Oh yes, exactly.
So that is the key point.
This was another question because we've been looking for a number of years and nobody was like interested, at least in Poland, just to be involved in such research. Because it's too far, and plus Gallenism, it's ridiculous. It was like 2,000 years ago, and no one now can like check whether the game was right or wrong. Are you more optimistic? So do you think that there are still people that can believe that all those procedures, at least to some extent?
I think it would be easier. It would be easier to find someone in the medical sphere or in sciences than to find someone in humanities. Because in humanities, it somehow became fashionable to laugh about these treatments rather than to think what they may have done actually, whether there was a reason why they did it. So I'm quite optimistic about it, that we will be able to find doctors. In particular, since this text has a lot of clear data that can basically be extracted, and he describes the symptoms in a very clear way. So I think it can be rationalized. Yeah.
Take for the time. So, but there was a comment, and this is a failure of ours. It doesn't have to be, say, anything important for the rest of the world. And now I open the discussion. There must be a number of comments on what Barbara said. Sean, just feel well.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, fantastic.
Great, hi, thanks. It's great to see you, Barbara, and really just fantastic work and lecture. So I just have a question, just always my same question, again, about identifications. And I was wondering, really, do you find a kind of consistency in the use of ingredients between, say, Aetius, Polyvagina, and Actuarius? Like, do they change? And to what extent can we see that there's a kind of change in the medical marketplace of this time? That's the first question. So that's just is there consistency in the ingredients and basically in the recipes that we find, or do we find really something new going on?
Yeah, so that's actually three questions, because that would mean that we need to define more clearly whether Paul of Aegina and Ioannes Archiatrus mentioned, I mean, if they use the same plant name, do they actually mean the same plant? So that's obviously the the other question.
Yes.
And we assume we are optimistic. So our premise is that Dioscorides was quite influential, and we assume that there was quite a lot of continuity here. I mean, when it comes to Ioannes Archiatrus, then it's much more simplified. There are some exotic ingredients in composite medications, so exotic animal parts, some imported spices, such as pepper and cinnamon and aloe, possibly ginger. I recently discovered that you can grow ginger in Mediterranean countries, which came as a bit of a surprise to me. Yeah, so it is very much simplified. It's condensed down, and this is also one of the reasons why we chose this text, because someone reduced it to something that they could afford or procure on the countryside. And that must have been also, must have had an effect of whatever description. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. So yeah, it is a simplification in my text as to whether there is innovation. That is a very complex question, and that would mean evaluation, whether the simplification might actually make it better, for instance. So that is something that I can't really answer because it's too complex.
So yeah, I was just wondering if if Archiatrus is going from, an earlier set of texts, but the names have changed, how do you show that there's a kind of consistency of the recipe over time? Just these are really complex questions, but I suppose that's for another time.
I mean, we didn't do it because it was too complex. It would be an enormous amount of tagging. We tagged the whole text of Ioannes Archiatrus. I tagged it. The we part of the project did the analysis, so I did the philology myself. Yeah, so the question is, I can't answer the question because that would mean that I would know whether Paul of Aegina or Ioannes Archiatrus had a valid treatment, and that we haven't tried it out, so we don't know. We looked up a number of these plants, so that was the we part of the project. So everybody together we worked on this, and yeah, so a substantial amount of plants that are mentioned in these texts, which we think we have identified, actually had a proven effect. So yes, so there was a lot of valid treatment in there. How it compares to Paul of Aegina, it's a huge corpus, and I don't think, I mean, in my lifetime, certainly, I don't think it would be possible, because that would be for one person about, I don't know, I can't even estimate how long it would take to go through all of those recipes. You can look at certain samples. So the samples we looked at, they were chosen by the scientists. I compiled a first translation of the text and basically substituted any unknown plants by a tag. That again brought out quite a lot of structure. So, if all the recipes either contained olive oil, vinegar, honey, milk, one of those really well-known, absolutely certain words, then we could already identify quite a lot of these. Yeah, it would be a huge task. So we focused our attention on some isolated, really promising recipes, where also in particular with the charring, where we actually were certain we knew what it was. So seashells or something like this. Yeah, but as for now, I can't answer it. It would be great if someone would join me for this project. It would be very large, and it would involve a lot of, research assistance and tagging and so on. I think it would be possible to extract more statistical data, meaningful statistical data, but we just looked at samples, basically. So for the plants, we looked at the whole range of plants. We then focused our attention on a selection of those where we actually could perform the analysis, so that because we had enough data to do so. But if you want to do a comprehensive analysis in comparison with Paul of Aegina, that's a huge task.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Pose a question or have a comment.
Sean?
Well, I would ask another one if I don't want to abuse the position, but I will ask again about the actual procedure for tagging the text. What did that look like? Were you using TEI and XML, or was it?
I work in. I submitted it to the Welcome Open Research platform, and once I'm back home tomorrow evening, I will authorize it for so they formatted it. That's the whole story. I work in LaTeX.
Okay, okay.
That's what I'm using, but the tagging itself, it was in a plain text format. So something like, think Notepad or something like this, just plain text. And so the tags basically are JC, which is the name for our text that the scientists wanted to call it JC. And then there's another letter that is animal, mineral, plant, other, mixed, and unknown. These are the categories we had. So anything that had leaves or roots was then JCP, P for plant. Anything which we knew was an animal was JCA. So animal products were also in this category. It was very, very simplistic. So basically, it was a matter. I had the Greek text and I translated it, and I ran the Greek text in a plain text format through Antconc, which is a concordance software, which is free, which is wonderful also for proofreading. And it compiled me a word list. And I sorted these words then into categories, which was quite straightforward. So plant, animals, all the words I knew already. And then there were a few more complex categories. So I sorted out the materia medica. I assigned it into groups. And there were very few unknowns. I don't have these statistics here, but it's a very short list of unknown words. And yeah, so it was Antconc, the free concordance software that I used for the linguistics and the word list and so on. And to search for the context, it makes life much easier. So you can click on a word and then you see the context and so on. So basically, it compiles if you click on vinegar, a Greek word for vinegar. So then it brings up a list of all the mentions of vinegar with half a sentence before and half a sentence after it. And this software just makes it much easier to sort out what kind of ingredient it was. So I started assuming I know nothing. I have no idea. And started with words that I was certain about, so milk and so on, and then checked everything across multiple times. So if the item was not described in my text, I was very careful. So quite a lot of these are actually in the unknown category to this day. If I wasn't entirely certain that it was a plant, for instance. Because sometimes you can't, I mean, there's a plant called batrachos in my text. It says it's a plant, but the word means frog.
Frog,
so there's
yeah.
a plant called frog. Yeah, you see that could be one of those problems. Yeah, so I was extremely cautious with all these words that come up. And if it wasn't described in my text, then I was extremely careful at finding other sources to find out whether it's probably a plant or not. And then in the end, I added a confidence factor. So from 4 to 1, 4 means I'm certain I know what it is, and 1 means I actually, I think it might be, but I don't actually know for certain. So that is how I did it. Yeah, so it means of software, there was Antconc, which is extremely good. And apart from this, it was a very straightforward text editor like Notepad with multiple lists. And in the end, I copied everything manually into a spreadsheet because that's the software that the scientists use.
Okay.
Yeah, so but that was the final step. So I had everything in. I had 6 or 7 Notepad documents open. And paper was written in LaTeX. This is what I generally use for anything, because I find it makes thinking much easier because it's very structured.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think Ioannes wants to.
Okay, do you hear me? Can I ask? I have made a comment, a question in the meeting chat. Can you read it? Of course, I want to congratulate and thank you for this really interesting, fascinating organization of your material and the questions you have about it and the way you presented this question to us, because they will be helpful for us for just working on similar texts. So thank you. About the materials, because in your first answer to Professor Cohen, you have mentioned the exotic materials.
Yeah.
Are these materials, this kind of material is the known one, or we are used to find it from the Dioscurides zone, or you find some new perhaps materials that are not so common? Do you have noticed something like that?
There are very few mentions of this. So we have a few mentions of animal parts from tigers, lions, bears, and various other unusual animals. We don't know whether they would have been sold as a composite medication and whether they actually contained what it said, or whether it is something alchemical, for instance. That could also be the case. We don't know. So yeah, we have to. We didn't work on these also because of a lack of data, and it wasn't a particularly strong recipe as well. So that one we didn't do, but very, very little. In means of imported ingredients, there are the old arguments as to whether the pepper that they mention is indeed pepper or whether it's a substitute. I can't say anything about it. He says the pepper that we also eat, that we add to food.
Okay.
So
it's very interesting. If this is the mention, also there is a clarification by the John Actuarius. So it's very interesting that we have this clarification also, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm waiting. I'm looking forward to see the text.
Yeah. And sorry if I start talking into your text. It is because there is a strange time lag to the team's communication. So okay. I can see you, but sometimes the sound arrives a bit later than I can see here. So in of imported ingredients, I mean pepper that is mentioned as something that they add into food. It is something I find very strange because, as we all know, pepper only grows in certain parts of southern India. It doesn't grow anywhere else. And how do you import it? So it takes 6 months to take it from. We have these descriptions, but how do you import it in a way that a peasant in the mountains of Cyprus and not a wealthy peasant would be able to buy it and eat it? So this is the part where I'm lost for words, but apparently it was available. So the people who are mentioned in the text were very poor. The text sometimes mentions, if you don't have seawater, take salted water or something like this. So and also some of the patients were extremely poor. So these were laborers, people who basically had to work until they collapsed. And it is very, very strange. But for whatever reason, they had pepper, they had cinnamon, and pepper is mentioned as something that they used to eat.
Thank you.
So thank you. Any more comments? But do we actually know prices of pepper? For instance, the 13th century. The problem, how spread or how popular was pepper? How popular were its prices? Yeah. There's something and edited this very portion, and in some countries it's was added into many dishes, like for instance meat dishes, like for instance in Greece.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can't think that this is something that requires. I mean, that is especially expensive. Yeah. Especially just normal. and you get varieties, yeah?
Mhm.
Like, for instance, cassia, which is definitely
Yeah.
less expensive, and the regular cinnamon is the more expensive, yeah, the one. So
Yeah. It doesn't mean, I mean, the only thing I can say is that in my text, the doctor who is not educated and who has very little infrastructure and money and means writes the pepper that we eat. So that is his word. It's not something that he has from other literature. So he says pepper, and that's the pepper that we eat. So it's not a pepper that is imported as a medication, but pepper that is basically that you could take from the kitchen. And yeah, he mentions it. And we have these descriptions of the trade routes from classical antiquity. It wouldn't have gone any faster, so 6 months round trip to get the pepper. Yeah, it was affordable. So, and it was affordable in an area where seawater may have been difficult to get. Yeah, apart from this, the infrastructure of John the physician's practice, laboratory, whatever you want to call it. So he made quite a lot of the medication himself. It reminds me of a kitchen. So he had glass vessels that he put in the sun, and he had frying pans and other things that you might use in the kitchen. So pestle and mortar, for instance, which he used to grind things. So it was not particularly sophisticated. And if you look at the plants that are most commonly mentioned, you can find those locally on the countryside, most of those. Also, the other things such as olive oil, these are things that are abundantly available on the countryside.
does
Yeah.
this speak a lot about substitutes for something that you can substitute, for instance, pepper with roux, or with something that's hot? And
Yeah, pepper and roux I have not seen. There are a few substitutes in there, but not that many. Yeah, it is difficult to describe. When you read the text, you get a really good feel for the finances that he had and the patience and so on. So it was someone who did not have much. That's how I would describe it, and who had made things himself. And he had certain means, but then on the other hand, he treated someone who basically collapsed, or who has injuries from work or something like this. Yeah.
But does it happen very often that he says, for instance, when you don't have something like that, you can take something like that?
It does happen, but not too common. Yeah, it's not that frequent. Yeah. Anything else? How I could? I mean, as I said, it has been accepted for open review, so I will publish it soon. And then you can see yourself. And I think perhaps the most important part is once you remove the dialectal surface of the text, you'll see the structure. And if you also start to look at tags, so my translation still contains quite a lot of tags, then you again can see a structure rather than chaos and dialect, which is quite confusing. But perhaps we just have to rethink our perception of pharmacy and medicine as practiced in villages, as opposed to pharmacy and medicine practiced by the likes of Galen or Theophanes, people who worked at in very luxurious circumstances, had lots of means, and import routes and all the books they might think of. So perhaps it is really the case that village medicine might be more suitable for evaluation in modern medicine because it's so simplified as well. this was the point I was trying to get across in my paper.
Fantastic. What we discussed today in the morning, that Galen also mentioned those country doctors that had special ways for special people that was inhabit the country, because he knew that people in the country are different from those ones that inhabit the urban areas, and different substances should be used for this sake. So
yes, and I think the text has a lot of potential, and it's now accessible. So for doctors, it has been modified in a way that a doctor can work with it. So I have these lists with tags and confidence factors. So even if I mention it, even if I translate a plant name, you can just check it against the index and see whether my translation is highly speculative or whether I'm completely certain or somewhere in the middle. And I think this means that a doctor can now, scientists can now work with the text. And what we have been planning is basically testing certain ingredients against pathogens in a lab. So I have someone who can do that. But these are insofar just plans. So I just have two hands, and we are currently seeing the seeing the output through peer review. So this is where we are at right now. Would be easier in a different life where more time is available as well. But something I'd like to highlight as well. So we did this through the pandemic. As I said, starting in November 2019, and it was an extremely tough time. In particular, since I was the head of the project as well. So it was constant change and constant sort of executive decisions and discussions with people on what we are going to do next, and whether we are going to hold the workshop in Israel or not, whether we will be able to get back to the lab, and how we are going to restructure our work. And amongst all this, in a context where it wasn't, if you go to the supermarket, you might catch COVID and die. So it was all very life and death as well. So I think I'm still amazed. We made it to the end, and we have an output. It wasn't with a lab-based strand. It didn't go as straight, so it was more bunched towards the end, which is why these papers aren't out yet. But in general, so we made it. And this is again an achievement. There were points, as you all remember, when we weren't sure whether and how and so on work would be possible to continue, but we did in the end. So it is easy to forget these circumstances. So I'm now in Lodz. I've just discovered that in my travel bag, I still had masks. I had surgical masks. They seem rather bizarre right now. Why do I carry surgical masks with me? They were in my suitcase. That's where they live, obviously, because I'm traveling and I might need them on the plane. So we are now back almost to normal, but this past needs to be taken into account as well, and the impact it had on research as well.
Barbara, it's not that strange, no?
Okay, you also have one. Yeah, I have mine here. So it's but we have to a certain extent returned to normal. But the impact of the pandemic is lasting, and obviously what we are publishing now, could we have done better and could we have done more? Certainly. I mean, if I wouldn't have had to come up with all these horrible decisions on how we are going to continue with the research, and how we are going to postpone this and do something else instead first, and so on. Sure. But it just didn't happen that way. We managed to get the core outputs done, so that we completed the work, just not in the same sequence as planned. but we are there. And yeah.
So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. But it is would I have had more research funding for the next big project now without the pandemic? Possibly, but it's you can't speculate about all these things. So yeah, so the stage right now. So we had a 6-month extension. The project finished at the end of April, and right now things are under review. So this is where we are.
Do you have any more questions or more comments?
Yes, and sorry if I'm speaking to the screen. It just feels natural. I'm back at online teaching right now, as it were, looking at the screen rather than at the people in the room.
I don't think anymore. Yeah, I can't see.
And the time is up.
So if the time's up, so we can applaud once again, Barbara.
Thank you.
For this fascinating lecture, and thank you everyone that's on the computer that has found some time, especially on these hectic days of ours, for joining us and being with us. This is pleasure, enormous honor, and
yes, also
to have you.
Also from me, thank you. It is very touching that you all attended online and the people who are here in the room. So it means really a lot to me.
So thank you, and next time we'll meet probably in the same way.
Thanks very much for hosting.
Good see. Okay, so have fun. Thank you.
Thank you.